Pack your bags before the bank takes everything, Vanessa said as she slid the house keys across the dinner table only 6 days after my husband was buried. My son Daniel stared down at his untouched mashed potatoes and said nothing. The dining room felt colder than the February rain tapping against the windows, colder than the cemetery had felt that morning when I stood beside Richard's grave trying to understand how 42 years of marriage could disappear under 6 feet of frozen ground. The candles on the table flickered softly beside the roast chicken I had forced myself to cook out of habit more than hunger. Richard always loved Sunday dinners. Even during the hardest years, he believed families should sit together at the table at least once a week. But that night, sitting across from my daughter-in-law in the house Richard built with his own hands, I realized I was no longer family to them. Vanessa folded her manicured hands neatly over a stack of papers stamped with legal markings. She wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and her expression carried that polished sympathy wealthy people use when they want to appear kind while saying something cruel. "Howard thinks it's best if we move quickly," she continued softly. "The estate is in much worse condition than Richard admitted." I blinked slowly. Richard hated debt. My husband tracked every dollar in little leather notebooks he kept inside his desk drawer upstairs. He refinanced the house once in 1998 and complained about it for nearly 10 years afterward. The idea that he would secretly leave me drowning in debt made no sense at all. "What estate problems?" I asked quietly. Vanessa exchanged a glance with Daniel before pushing the papers slightly closer toward me. "Medical bills, taxes, loans. There's really no easy way to say this, Evelyn. The house may need to be sold." Sold. The word echoed through my chest like something hollow breaking open. My eyes drifted toward the hallway where Richard's coat still hung beside the front door exactly where he left it the night before his heart attack. I had not touched it. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before sunrise, I stood there holding the sleeve just to remember the shape of him. "Dad wanted Mom taken care of," Daniel muttered finally, though he still would not look at me. Vanessa reached over and rested her hand on his wrist like she was calming a nervous child. "And we are taking care of her," she said gently. "But realistically, Evelyn can't manage this property alone anymore." Realistically. Another polished word. Another quiet knife. Outside, headlights swept across the dining room windows as a car passed slowly through the neighborhood Richard loved so much. Cedar Hill Estates had once felt safe to me. Familiar. Warm. Now the entire house seemed to tilt slightly beneath me, as though grief itself had loosened the foundation. I looked down at the papers. Legal terms blurred together across the pages. Transfer authorization. Estate restructuring. Temporary financial guardianship. My fingers tightened around the cloth napkin in my lap. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock Richard inherited from his father chimed 8 times. Vanessa gave me a small smile. "The sooner you pack, the easier this will be for everyone." Something inside me turned cold then. Not anger. Not panic. Something quieter. More dangerous. Because Richard Carter may have trusted too easily near the end of his life, but I knew my husband better than anyone sitting at that table. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Richard would never have left me defenseless. Later that night, after Daniel and Vanessa went upstairs, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing untouched dishes beneath warm water. My wedding ring caught the light above the sink. 42 years. I dried my hands slowly and glanced toward the dark hallway leading to Richard's study. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The door was slightly open. Richard never left that door open. Never. I stood in the hallway for several seconds staring at the narrow opening in Richard's study door, while the dishwasher hummed softly behind me. My husband had always been particular about that room. He called it his sanctuary. Every evening after dinner, he would sit at his old oak desk balancing checkbooks, organizing receipts, or reading financial journals with his wire-rimmed glasses sliding halfway down his nose. Even after retirement, Richard treated paperwork with military discipline. The study door stayed closed. Always. Slowly I walked toward it, my slippers brushing softly against the hardwood floors. The house felt unnaturally quiet now that Daniel and Vanessa had gone upstairs to the guest bedroom they started using after the funeral. 6 days earlier, this same house had been filled with casseroles, sympathy cards, and people speaking in whispers. Now all that remained was silence and the faint scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements slowly wilting in the dining room. I pushed the study door open carefully. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Richard's desk lamp cast a warm amber circle across the room. His leather chair sat pushed slightly back as though he had just stepped away for coffee. But then I noticed the drawers. 3 of them were not fully closed. Richard hated clutter. He never left drawers open. A strange feeling settled over me as I crossed the room. I opened the top drawer first. Empty. The second drawer held scattered pens and old utility bills. But the small black ledger books Richard kept for decades were gone. My chest tightened. I crouched beside the filing cabinet near the window. Several folders had been removed entirely, leaving thin gaps between hanging files. Real estate taxes, insurance policies, investment statements. Missing. I sat back slowly on my heels. Outside the window, rain tapped against the glass in steady rhythms while wind bent the tall pine trees lining the backyard. Richard planted those trees himself 20 years ago, because he said they made the property feel protected from the world. Suddenly I did not feel protected at all. I stood and looked around the room more carefully. That was when I noticed the faint smell of Vanessa's perfume lingering near the desk. Vanilla and jasmine. Expensive. Too polished. She had been in here. Earlier that afternoon, while I was upstairs folding black funeral dresses into drawers I hoped never to open again, someone had gone through Richard's study. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf beside the fireplace. One frame sat crooked near the bottom shelf. Picked it up carefully. It was an old photograph of Richard holding Daniel at age 8 beside a fishing boat in Maine. Both of them smiling proudly beneath matching baseball caps. My throat tightened painfully. Daniel used to worship his father. When he was little, he followed Richard everywhere like a shadow. Saturday mornings meant pancakes, fishing trips, and hardware store runs. Somewhere along the years, Vanessa had slipped quietly between them like water through cracks in concrete. I straightened the frame and placed it back carefully. Then I noticed something else. The small brass key Richard kept inside the ceramic bowl on his bookshelf was missing too. My pulse quickened. I knew that key. Richard never told Daniel about it, because he believed some responsibilities belonged only between husband and wife. 20 years ago, after a minor identity theft incident, Richard rented a safety deposit box at Cedar Valley Bank. He joked that he trusted banks more than hiding things under mattresses like his parents did during the Depression. I suddenly remembered him mentioning it briefly last fall while balancing paperwork at the kitchen table. "If anything ever happens to me," he had said casually, "you will find everything you need there." At the time I laughed and told him to stop talking like an old man. Now my hands trembled against the edge of his desk as the memory returned with chilling clarity. Someone had taken the key before I even knew I needed it. The next morning I woke before sunrise to the sound of cabinet doors closing downstairs. For a moment, half asleep beneath the heavy quilt Richard and I bought during our anniversary trip to Vermont, I forgot he was gone. My hand moved instinctively across the mattress searching for the warmth that had been beside me every morning for more than 4 decades. There was only cold fabric. The grief hit differently each day. Sometimes it arrived like a crushing wave that stole the air from my lungs. Other times it settled quietly over everything like winter frost. I sat up slowly and slipped my feet into my slippers, before pulling my robe tightly around me. The digital clock beside the bed read 5:42 a.m. Richard would have already been downstairs making coffee by then, humming old Frank Sinatra songs while reading the newspaper. Instead, the house carried unfamiliar sounds now. Sharp sounds. Efficient sounds. Vanessa's sounds. As I walked downstairs, the scent of expensive coffee beans drifted through the kitchen. Vanessa stood at the counter typing rapidly on her phone, while wearing fitted workout clothes and spotless white sneakers. She barely looked up when I entered. "Morning," she said casually. "I already called the realtor. She is stopping by at noon." I froze beside the kitchen island. The realtor? Vanessa reached for her coffee mug. "We need to know what the house is worth in its current condition." Current condition. She spoke about my home the way people discuss damaged property after a storm. I opened the refrigerator quietly and stared at the untouched leftovers from the funeral dinner. Aluminum trays filled with casseroles sat stacked beside grocery store pies no one would eat. Grief meals. Meals delivered by neighbors who still believed families took care of one another. "You are moving very fast," I said carefully. Vanessa shrugged one shoulder. "Howard says delays will only make the estate situation worse." Estate situation. Another phrase polished smooth enough to hide whatever truth sat underneath it. I poured myself a cup of coffee and immediately noticed something else wrong. Richard's favorite ceramic mug was gone from the cabinet. The navy blue one with tiny chips near the handle from years of use. I looked around slowly. The framed recipe card his mother wrote in 1972 had disappeared from the wall too. Little pieces of Richard were quietly vanishing from the house, one object at a time. "Where is Daniel?" I asked. "Still sleeping," Vanessa answered without emotion. "He was up late going through financial records." Financial records. My stomach tightened again. Richard spent his entire adult life protecting this family financially. He built Carter Home Supply from a single hardware store into 3 successful locations across Ohio. He paid Daniel's college tuition in full. He paid for Daniel and Vanessa's wedding on Cape Cod, even though Vanessa insisted on imported flowers and a string quartet. Richard planned for everything, which meant none of this made sense. At exactly noon, a black luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. A tall blonde woman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Vanessa greeted her warmly at the front door while I stood silently near the staircase. "This is the formal dining room," Vanessa explained confidently as they walked through the house. "The kitchen was updated 8 years ago, but the bathrooms need modernization." I gripped the wooden staircase railing so tightly my knuckles ached. She was already speaking like the owner. The realtor paused beside the living room fireplace and smiled politely toward me. "You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Carter." Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped in smoothly. "Not for much longer." The words landed softly, calmly, but they settled inside my chest like ice. Later that afternoon, after the realtor finally left, I went upstairs to retrieve an old sweater from the hall closet. That was when I noticed the guest bedroom door slightly open. Inside, Vanessa sat at the desk with stacks of paper spread across the bed. My eyes drifted toward the top page. Across the header, in bold black letters, I read the words "Property Transfer Authorization." I stood frozen outside the guest bedroom doorway for several seconds while Vanessa continued sorting through paperwork without realizing I was there. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the half-closed curtains, casting pale stripes across the bed where stacks of legal documents covered the comforter. Her manicured fingers moved quickly, confidently, sliding pages into neat piles the same way a banker might count money that already belonged to them. My eyes stayed fixed on the words at the top of the document. Property Transfer Authorization. Beneath it sat another folder labeled Estate Consolidation Plan. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. Something inside me was changing. Grief was still there, heavy and constant like winter fog, but beneath it another feeling had begun to settle quietly into place. Awareness. I stepped back before Vanessa noticed me and walked slowly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Every framed family photograph along the wall suddenly looked different now. There was Daniel at 16 holding his driver's license with Richard's proud arm around his shoulders. There we all were on the beach in Hilton Head 10 summers ago before everything became polished and distant and carefully managed by Vanessa's quiet influence. I paused beside the oldest photograph in the hallway. Richard and I stood outside our first hardware store in Columbus in 1981. The sign above us was crooked because we could not afford professional installation yet. Richard wore a plaid shirt with sawdust still on the sleeves, and I held the store ledger against my chest because I handled every account personally back then. We looked exhausted in that picture. Young. Hopeful. Together. I carried the frame into the bedroom and sat carefully at the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly beneath my weight, and for a brief moment I could almost imagine Richard sitting beside me again. He used to say marriage was not built during happy years. It was built during frightening ones. During winters when the furnace broke. During months when the business nearly failed. During nights spent calculating bills at the kitchen table after Daniel was asleep upstairs. Richard never hid finances from me because he believed secrets weaken families. Which was why none of this fit the man I knew. My eyes drifted toward Richard's side of the dresser where his silver watch still rested neatly beside his wallet. I picked up the watch carefully. The leather strap carried faint cracks from decades of wear. Every morning at exactly 7:30, Richard fastened this watch before leaving for work. Even after smartphones made watches unnecessary, he refused to stop wearing it because his father gave it to him on the day he opened his first store. My thumb brushed against the back engraving. Time builds everything worth keeping. That was Richard. Steady, careful, patient, not reckless, not secretive. Certainly not the kind of man who would leave his wife financially destroyed. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Daniel stood partially inside the doorway, his shoulders tense beneath an old Ohio State sweatshirt. For a moment he looked like the teenage boy who used to ask Richard for advice about baseball games and college applications. But the moment passed quickly. "Mom," he said quietly, "Vanessa and I are trying to make this easier." Easier. Another carefully selected word. I looked down at Richard's watch resting in my palm. "Did your father ever tell you about financial problems?" I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated too long. "Not directly. Did you ever see overdue notices? Collection calls? Anything unusual?" His eyes shifted away from mine toward the bedroom window. "Howard said there are things Dad kept private near the end." I stared at my son for several seconds. Richard Carter shared every account password with me, every investment statement, every insurance policy. Yet somehow my own son now believed a lawyer he barely knew over the woman who built that life beside his father for 42 years. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "Vanessa scheduled another meeting tomorrow afternoon." "Of course she did," I answered softly. After he left, I sat alone in the quiet room listening to the grandfather clock downstairs mark each passing second. Then slowly, carefully, I turned Richard's watch over again and noticed something I had never seen before. The back panel was slightly loose. For several long moments I sat motionless on the edge of the bed staring at Richard's watch resting in my hands while evening shadows slowly stretched across the bedroom walls. The loosened back panel caught the light from the bedside lamp in a way I had never noticed before. Richard wore this watch almost every day for 30 years, yet somehow I had never thought to inspect it closely. My fingers moved carefully along the edge until I felt a tiny notch beneath the metal casing. Slowly I pressed it with my thumbnail. A soft click broke the silence. The back panel shifted open just enough to reveal a folded piece of paper hidden inside. My breath caught in my throat. With trembling fingers I unfolded the tiny slip carefully. Two things were written in Richard's familiar handwriting, a series of numbers, and one sentence. "If things feel wrong, trust yourself." I stared at the note while a chill moved slowly through my chest. Richard knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to leave me a message hidden inside the one possession he carried every day. I looked again at the numbers. The first part was clearly the safety deposit box number at Cedar Valley Bank. The second looked like a date. October 14th. Last fall. Roughly 4 months before his heart attack. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to remember anything unusual around that time. Richard had become quieter during those months. Not distant exactly, but thoughtful. Sometimes I caught him watching Vanessa with an unreadable expression during family dinners. Once, after she left the room, he asked me if Daniel seemed happy lately. At the time I brushed the question aside because I assumed he was simply worried about our son working too much. Now those memories returned differently, sharper. Downstairs, cabinet doors opened and closed again. Vanessa was preparing dinner. The sound no longer felt domestic. It felt territorial. I slipped the note into my robe pocket just as my phone buzzed softly on the nightstand beside me. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number from downtown Columbus. For a second I considered ignoring it. Grief had brought endless calls from insurance agents, legal assistants, and distant relatives pretending to care while searching for details about Richard's estate. But something made me answer anyway. "Mrs. Carter?" An older male voice asked carefully. "Yes. This is Walter Pierce from Cedar Valley Bank. I apologize for calling during such a difficult week, but I need to speak with you privately regarding your husband's account instructions." Every muscle in my body tightened. I stood slowly and walked toward the bedroom door, lowering my voice. "What kind of instructions?" There was a pause on the line. "Your husband left very specific directions concerning the safety deposit box, registered jointly under your names." My heart pounded hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. "Mr. Pierce," I said quietly. "Someone already removed the key." Silence. Then the banker spoke more carefully than before. "That should not be possible, Mrs. Carter. The contents cannot be accessed without both identification and secondary verification." I leaned against the hallway wall as relief and confusion collided inside me. Vanessa had the key. But apparently the key alone was useless. "Your husband visited me personally in October," Walter continued softly. He appeared concerned. "He instructed me to contact you directly if anyone besides you attempted early access." I closed my eyes tightly. October. The same date written inside the watch. Downstairs, I suddenly heard Vanessa laughing softly at something on television, while Daniel's deeper voice murmured beside her. They sounded relaxed, comfortable, like people already planning their future. "Mrs. Carter?" Walter asked gently. "I strongly recommend you come to the bank alone tomorrow morning." Alone. The word settled heavily inside me. For days I had felt trapped inside my own grief, surrounded by legal terms and quiet manipulation, while everyone treated me like a fragile old woman too confused to understand what was happening. But Richard had seen this coming. Somehow, he had seen enough to prepare for it. "I will be there," I answered firmly. After the call ended, I slipped Richard's watch back onto the dresser and looked at my reflection in the bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at me still looked exhausted. Her silver hair was unstyled. Her eyes were swollen from sleepless nights and too much silent crying. But beneath the grief, something colder had finally begun to awaken. And for the first time since Richard died, I no longer felt afraid. The next morning I left the house before sunrise while Daniel and Vanessa were still asleep upstairs. The air outside carried the sharp cold of late February, and a thin layer of frost covered Richard's old Ford pickup parked beside the garage. I sat behind the steering wheel for several moments, gripping my purse tightly while the engine warmed. This was the first morning in 42 years that I had driven somewhere important without Richard beside me. He used to rest his hand lightly on my knee during long drives, especially when he sensed I was anxious. The memory hurt more than I expected. Cedar Valley Bank sat downtown between an insurance office and a bakery Richard loved, because they still made cinnamon rolls from scratch every morning. I parked across the street and noticed the bakery lights glowing warmly through the windows. For one painful second I almost turned around, bought 2 cinnamon rolls out of habit, and drove home to Richard. Instead I crossed the street alone. Walter Pierce was older than I expected. Mid-70s perhaps. Thin silver hair. Navy cardigan beneath a brown tweed jacket. The kind of man who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards. He greeted me quietly and guided me into a small private office near the back of the bank. "I was very sorry to hear about Richard," he said sincerely. He was one of the few men left who still believed a handshake mattered. My throat tightened. "He trusted you." Walter nodded slowly before removing a folder from his desk drawer. "And I believe he had reasons for that trust." He slid the folder carefully toward me. Inside sat copies of bank visitation records. My eyes immediately caught Vanessa's name listed twice beside Howard Green's. Both visits had occurred within 48 hours after Richard's funeral. "They tried accessing the box?" I asked quietly. Walter folded his hands together. "They insisted there had been confusion about ownership. Mr. Green claimed you were emotionally unfit to manage financial matters immediately after the loss." Emotionally unfit. The word settled coldly inside me. Walter continued carefully. "Richard specifically instructed us never to release the contents without your direct authorization in person." I stared at the visitation logs while pieces slowly began fitting together in my mind. Vanessa was moving too quickly because she believed something valuable remained hidden. Something Richard never wanted her to find first. Walter stood and retrieved a small metal box from the secured cabinet behind his desk. Even from several feet away, I recognized Richard's handwriting on the label. Carter Family Trust. My pulse pounded hard against my ribs. "Walter, place the box on the desk between us. Richard updated the contents in October," he explained softly. Afterward, he asked me a strange question. I looked up slowly. "What question?" Walter hesitated. He asked whether legal betrayal usually comes from strangers or from family. For a moment neither of us spoke. Outside the office window, snowflakes drifted slowly through the gray Ohio sky while morning traffic crawled past the bank. Richard knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to worry. Enough to prepare. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the metal box. Inside rested several sealed envelopes, a flash drive, and a thick leather folder containing financial records. On top sat one handwritten letter addressed directly to me. Evelyn. Seeing my name written in Richard's careful handwriting nearly broke me. I pressed the envelope gently against my chest before opening it. The letter inside was only 1 page long. If you are reading this, it means something does not feel right. Trust your instincts. I have protected this family for many years, but lately I fear someone has mistaken kindness for weakness. Everything you need is here. Do not let anyone rush you. Especially not Daniel. My vision blurred instantly. Especially not Daniel. Richard never would have written those words lightly. Walter quietly handed me a tissue while I struggled to steady my breathing. Then he lowered his voice carefully. Mrs. Carter, there is something else you should know. 3 months ago, Richard transferred ownership of the house entirely into your name. The room went completely silent. That is impossible, I whispered. Walter slid another document across the desk. My signature stared back at me beside Richard's. Not copied. Real. Because suddenly I remembered. October 14th. Richard asking me to sign what he casually called updated retirement paperwork at the kitchen table, while Vanessa talked loudly on speakerphone nearby in the other room. My stomach turned slowly as realization settled over me. Richard had protected me long before he died, and someone had been trying very hard to hide that fact. I drove home from Cedar Valley Bank with Richard's leather folder, resting on the passenger seat beside me like something alive and fragile. Snow continued falling steadily across Columbus, coating rooftops and sidewalks in pale white layers that made the entire neighborhood look quieter than usual. Richard always loved the first snowfall of the year. He used to stand at the kitchen window holding his coffee mug and say fresh snow made the world look honest for a little while because everything hidden became visible underneath it. I understood what he meant now. By the time I pulled into the driveway, Vanessa's SUV was already gone. Daniel's sedan remained parked near the garage, but the upstairs curtains were closed. I sat inside the truck for several moments gripping the steering wheel, while my mind replayed everything Walter Pierce had revealed at the bank. Richard transferred the house into my name months ago. Richard suspected betrayal. Richard warned me specifically about Daniel. The pain of that last truth sat heaviest inside my chest. Losing a husband to death was one kind of grief. Realizing your own son helped dismantle the life you built was another kind entirely. Inside the house, silence greeted me again. I removed my coat slowly and noticed fresh flowers arranged on the dining room table. White roses. Vanessa's favorite. She had replaced the funeral lilies already. Even grief in this house was being redecorated to fit her preferences. I carried Richard's folder upstairs and locked the bedroom door before sitting carefully at the desk near the window. Outside, snowflakes drifted softly past the glass while the grandfather clock downstairs ticked through the heavy afternoon silence. I opened the folder slowly. Inside sat copies of property deeds, trust agreements, bank records, and handwritten notes in Richard's precise lettering. The deeper I looked, the colder I became. Nearly every suspicious document Vanessa showed me over the past week contradicted the originals Richard stored at the bank. The supposed estate debt did not exist. The overdue loans were fabricated. Even the so-called emergency transfer authorization forms had inconsistencies in legal formatting. Howard Green was either incompetent or dishonest. Possibly both. Then I found something else. A printed email chain between Vanessa and Howard dated 2 weeks before Richard died. My stomach tightened immediately. The first message came from Vanessa. Daniel still does not know about the transfer issue. We need this finalized before Evelyn starts asking questions. I stared at the words for several long seconds. Transfer issue. Another email followed 3 days later from Howard. Richard is becoming more protective of the estate structure. Timing is critical now. My hands turned cold against the paper. Richard knew. He absolutely knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to start protecting me quietly behind the scenes. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes briefly while grief and fury tangled together inside me. Downstairs, I suddenly heard the front door open, followed by Daniel's voice calling my name. Quickly, I closed the folder and slid it beneath folded sweaters inside the dresser drawer just as footsteps climbed the stairs. Daniel knocked softly before entering. He looked tired. Older somehow. "Vanessa is meeting Howard tonight," he said carefully. "They want us all together tomorrow afternoon to finalize everything." Finalize everything. I studied my son's face closely. The same blue eyes Richard passed down to him. The same nervous habit of rubbing the back of his neck when uncomfortable. For one painful second I saw the little boy who cried after losing his first baseball game at age 9 because he thought disappointing his father meant losing his love. Richard spent hours comforting him that night. "What exactly are they finalizing?" I asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. "The house sale process mostly. Temporary asset control. Stuff like that. Stuff like that." My son now described the destruction of my financial security, with the same casual tone people use discussing cable bills. "Do you trust Howard Green?" I asked quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. "Of course. More than your father?" The question landed harder than I expected. Daniel looked away immediately. Silence filled the room. Then softly, almost defensively, he said, "Vanessa is only trying to protect us. Not me." The distinction hurt more than anger would have. After Daniel left, I sat alone listening to his footsteps fade downstairs. Then slowly, carefully, I reopened Richard's folder and removed the small black flash drive resting inside. Across the label in Richard's handwriting were 5 words that made my pulse stop completely. "Play this if they lie." That night I waited until the house fell completely silent before taking the flash drive downstairs to Richard's study. Snow continued falling outside, covering the backyard in thick white layers that reflected pale moonlight through the windows. The entire neighborhood looked frozen in time. Richard used to love nights like this. He said snowfall made even ugly things appear peaceful from a distance. I sat carefully at his desk and turned on the old desktop computer he refused to replace because he claimed newer machines were too clever for their own good. The screen flickered softly to life while the familiar hum of the hard drive filled the quiet room. For a moment my hands hovered over the keyboard. I was suddenly afraid of what I might discover. Afraid that hearing Richard's voice again would break something inside me permanently. But eventually I inserted the flash drive. Only one video file appeared on the screen. The timestamp showed it had been recorded less than 3 weeks before his death. My throat tightened painfully as I clicked play. Richard appeared sitting exactly where I was now sitting, wearing his gray cardigan and reading glasses. He looked tired, older than I remembered, but his eyes were steady, calm. "Evelyn," he began softly, "if you are watching this, then something has gone wrong." The sound of his voice nearly shattered me. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stop myself from crying aloud while tears blurred the screen instantly. Richard continued speaking carefully, like a man choosing every word with purpose. I wanted to believe I was imagining things. It would have been easier that way. But over the past year, I noticed inconsistencies in financial records and conversations that did not make sense. He paused briefly, rubbing his wedding ring with his thumb the way he always did when nervous. "Vanessa has been pressuring Daniel about money for a long time. I do not believe Daniel understands the full situation, but I also believe he stopped asking questions because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths." My chest tightened harder with every sentence. Richard looked directly into the camera then, and for a moment it felt like he was sitting across from me again. "If Howard Green presents documents claiming you owe debts or lack ownership of this house, those documents are false or manipulated. I transferred everything into your name because I no longer trusted the people surrounding this estate process." I closed my eyes briefly as grief rolled through me again, but beneath it came something else now. Clarity. Richard had spent months quietly protecting me while I remained blind beside him. "I know you," he said softly from the screen. "You will want to keep peace. You will want to protect Daniel even after he disappoints you. But listen carefully, Evelyn. Protect yourself first this time." The room fell silent after the video ended except for the ticking grandfather clock downstairs. I sat motionless staring at the dark screen while tears slipped quietly down my face. 42 years together, And somehow Richard still knew exactly what I needed to hear even after he was gone. Upstairs, floorboards creaked softly. Someone was awake. Quickly, I removed the flash drive and slipped it into my sweater pocket just before footsteps approached the study. The door opened slightly. Vanessa stood there holding a wine glass, her expression smooth and composed as always. "There you are," she said lightly. "Daniel was wondering where you went." I turned slowly in Richard's chair. Could not sleep. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the computer monitor before returning to my face. "Tomorrow is going to be emotionally exhausting," she said carefully. "Howard prepared the final paperwork already. Once everything is signed, you can finally relax and stop worrying about all this financial stress." Relax. Another carefully polished word wrapped around a threat. I studied her quietly beneath the warm desk lamp glow. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. Perfect sympathy. Yet suddenly all I could see was fear hidden behind her composure. Fear that Richard may have left something behind she could not control. Vanessa smiled gently. "You trust me, do you not?" For the first time since Richard died, I smiled back without sadness. "Not anymore," I answered softly. For one brief second the mask slipped. Just enough for me to see panic flash across her face before she recovered again. Then she quietly closed the study door behind her, and I heard her heels move quickly down the hallway toward Daniel. The following afternoon the sky hung low and gray above Cedar Hill Estates while freezing rain tapped softly against the dining room windows. Vanessa had transformed the room into something that no longer resembled the home Richard and I built together. The funeral flowers were gone. The family photographs had been rearranged. Even the tablecloth had been replaced with a pale linen runner that matched Vanessa's taste instead of mine. It felt less like a family home now and more like a staged model house waiting for strangers to tour it. Howard Green arrived precisely at 2 o'clock carrying a leather briefcase thick with paperwork. His expensive charcoal coat still glistened with rainwater as he stepped inside. "Mrs. Carter," he greeted smoothly, though his smile looked thinner than before. Daniel stood near the fireplace with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, avoiding eye contact again. Vanessa remained calm beside him, elegant in a cream cashmere sweater with her blonde hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck. Looking at her, no outsider would have guessed she had spent the past week trying to dismantle a widow's life piece by piece. "Let us make this as painless as possible," Howard said while arranging documents across the dining room table. "These signatures will authorize temporary estate restructuring until outstanding liabilities are resolved." Liabilities. More lies hidden inside professional language. I sat quietly at the head of the table where Richard always sat during family dinners. The same chair. The same view of the backyard he loved. Howard slid a silver pin toward me. "Once these are signed," he continued smoothly, "the property transfer process can begin immediately." I looked down at the papers without touching them. Property transfer authorization. Temporary guardianship review. Asset liquidation approval. Every document designed to remove control from me while pretending to protect me. Outside, freezing rain streaked down the windows in thin silver lines while silence stretched heavily through the room. Then softly I asked, "Did Richard approve these documents before he died?" Howard's expression barely shifted. "Your husband trusted me completely." "That is interesting," I replied calmly, reaching into my purse. "Because Richard left me something yesterday." Vanessa's posture stiffened instantly. Daniel finally looked up. Slowly, I placed the flash drive onto the table beside Howard's carefully prepared paperwork. No one spoke for several seconds. Howard cleared his throat lightly. "Mrs. Carter, grief can sometimes create confusion regarding legal matters." I almost smiled at that. Confusion. Another polished insult disguised as concern. Without breaking eye contact, I stood and walked to the television cabinet beside the fireplace. "Richard taught me how to connect every cable in this house because he believed people should know how things worked instead of depending on others." My hands remained perfectly steady as I inserted the flash drive. A moment later Richard's face appeared on the television screen. The entire room froze. "If you are watching this," Richard said calmly from the recording, "then someone has lied to my wife." Vanessa's face lost color almost immediately. Howard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Beside the fireplace, Daniel stared at the screen as though he could not breathe. Richard continued speaking clearly. He explained the house transfer, the fabricated debt claims, the concerns he developed regarding Vanessa and Howard's involvement with the estate. Every sentence stripped another layer from the careful illusion they built around me. Then came the final blow. "Daniel," Richard said directly into the camera, "if you allowed fear or convenience to blind you, I hope someday you become strong enough to face what you helped create." The room fell silent after the video ended. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Howard finally stood first, gathering papers into his briefcase with shaking hands. "I think perhaps there has been a misunderstanding," he muttered weakly. "No," I answered softly. "There has been a betrayal." Vanessa turned toward Daniel desperately. "You cannot seriously believe this changes everything." But Daniel no longer looked at her. He looked at me instead. For the first time in weeks, I saw shame in his eyes. Real shame. Slowly, I gathered Richard's original documents from my purse and placed them neatly on the table beside the false paperwork Howard prepared. Then I stood beside the dining room window looking out toward the snow-covered backyard, where Richard once taught Daniel to throw a baseball. "You wanted me frightened," I said quietly. "You wanted me grieving enough to surrender my life without asking questions." I turned back toward them calmly. But Richard knew me better than that. No one answered. They simply sat there surrounded by silence, exposed at last beneath the cold gray light filtering through the windows, while upstairs the grandfather clock continued marking each passing second inside the house they almost stole from me.